Good evening and welcome. My name is Beth Marshall, and I'm the Executive Director for the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight as we kick off the 2015-2016 Ambassador John Price and Marcia Price World Affair Lecture Series, presented in partnership with Westminster College. Tonight's events would not be possible without our sponsors and partners. Please join me in thanking Ambassador John Price and Marcia Price for their generous support. As always, it's an honor to have an opportunity to say thank you to Ambassador Price and Marcia Price, and truly on behalf of the UCCD board and staff, we definitely welcome you and thank you, community and globally minded members that join us tonight. I'd also would like to extend my deepest thanks to Westminster College for a valuable partnership. Westminster is both our lecture sponsor and generous host of UCCD's office on campus. It's an honor to be affiliated with a nationally recognized private comprehensive liberal arts educational institution, the only one in Utah, and to be surrounded by so many talented young leaders of tomorrow. By a show of hands, can you please do me the favor to recognize the students, staff, and administrators here tonight from Westminster College? This lecture series is both an opportunity for us to hear from leading experts on global issues and an opportunity for us to come together as a community to meet like-minded people, listen to various hot topics, and finally discuss issues and concerns about our increasingly complex world. I know that the knowledge that you will gain from this lecture series will make you and me more informed and hopefully more engaged citizens. As Utah's leader in professional and cultural exchanges, UCCD has been connecting Utah citizen diplomats with current and emerging leaders since 1967. We work as a private sector partnered with the U.S. Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program to match nearly 500 emerging world leaders and over 500 Utah volunteers to advance the knowledge of experts in health, education, economic development, civil society, human rights, and more. In fact, tonight we have the honor and the pleasure to recognize two of our individual guests who are here to discuss digital communications. Marina, Olga, if you can please stand and be recognized, as we are honored to have you here from other nations. If you are interested in learning more about UCCD's program or want to support us in our efforts, please ask how to one of our UCC staff as you depart from the auditorium tonight. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Warren Cook, a Westminster College ambassador, who will be introducing our distinguished guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Beth. As an award-winning author, chef, television personality, cuisine and culture expert, and educator, Amy Riolo is known for sharing history, culture, and nutrition through global cuisine. A Mediterranean diet advocate, Amy lectures on the pleasure and health of eating at the Library of Congress, universities, health organizations, and many international venues. She makes frequent appearances on numerous television and radio programs, both in the United States and abroad, and has created and appeared weekly in 90-second cooking videos entitled The Culture of Cuisine, which air on nationally syndicated news shows on 28 different channels across the United States. An accomplished author, Riolo's most recent book, The Mediterranean Diabetes Cookbook, was released in March 2010 and was named Best Diabetes Cookbook Ever by diabetesmind.com. Her second book, Nile Style, Egyptian Cuisine and Culture, won the World Gourmand Award for Best Arab Cuisine Book in the United States and was just released in a second edition. Her first book, Arabian Delights, Recipes and Princely Entertaining Ideas from the Arabian Peninsula, was chosen as one of the 16 volumes worth staining by the Washington Post. She is currently completing the Ultimate Mediterranean Diet Cookbook, which will be released in April of 2016. As a respected culinary diplomat, Amy has created menus, culinary ceremonies, and educational seminars for diplomats, international chefs, and world leaders, earning her the title of the Cook to the Kings by a Cairo newspaper in 2008. Amy is also the author of a noted culinary and cultural blog, amyriolo.blogspot.com, which is known for promoting little-known facts about global cuisines and the people who create them. As a successful restaurant consultant and graduate of Cornell University, Amy enjoys developing concepts, action plans, recipes, training seminars and guides, and themes for corporations, restaurants, and hotels. She has consulted international business owners, as well as worked as a food stylist for publishers and organizations. Amy uses her culinary expertise to write scripts for culinary movies and television programs. In addition to her professional work, Amy spends a great deal of her time supporting philanthropic efforts. She can often be found mentoring culinary students, teaching children's cooking classes, and participating on panels for charity events. One of the highlights of her volunteering career was chairing the Baltimore Luxor Alexandria Sister City Committee, which enabled her to obtain a grant to provide clean drinking water for a region outside of Luxor, Egypt. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the talented Amy Riolo.
No, I have a leveler. I think they're trying to balance it up here. That's better. Can everybody hear me now? Wonderful. Well, good evening, and thank you all so much for coming. The reason I don't like this mic is because I tend to hit it sometimes when I talk with my hands. Is the sound okay for everyone? Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out this evening and for supporting a topic which is so important to me. This is absolutely the perfect place to be, and it's really an honor to be part of this lecture series. So I was kind of looking at the different show of hands, and I saw a lot of people from the university. How many of you are from the UCCD? Okay, great. So it's a wonderful mix. Today is also the International Day of Democracy, so it's very timely that we're talking about some different international events. For those of you who are into social media, there's a culinary diplomacy hashtag that we could use, and these are all of my handles, as well as the handles for Utah diplomacy. So feel free to, chime in on any topic, or sometimes when I go to a lecture and I leave, it's about, the next day when I have a really good question I wish I could ask someone. So if you have any of my information, feel free to pose any of those questions later on, even after today. That's fine as well. The first thing that I'd like to do today is define diplomacy. So diplomacy itself is defined as the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, typically by a country's representative abroad, and the art of dealing with people in a sensitive and effective way. Public diplomacy is the communication with foreign publics to establish a dialogue designed to inform and to influence. And then, of course, UCCD is famous for the citizen diplomacy, so this is straight from their website, the concept that the individual has the right, even the responsibility, to shape US foreign relations one handshake at a time. And then we get to my topic of culinary diplomacy. And this is the idea of using cuisine to create cross-cultural understanding. And it's, of course, an age-old notion that's been taking place since the beginning of time that really has experienced a rebirth and has been branded while Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, because she developed something called the Diplomatic Culinary Partnership through the Department of State and the American Chef Corps, whose mission was to do this type of thing. And this is a program from an event that we had at the at the Department of State earlier this year to celebrate Expo Milan 2015 and all of the different opportunities that that posed, not only for Americans to showcase their culture, but also to influence trade. So during that ceremony, this is John Kerry making his remarks very specifically about how just by going to Italy and, for example, for a chef doing a demonstration with blueberries from Maine or with a potato from Idaho, how many sales and how many exports can be influenced by that from one little event. So he spoke very directly to that. And then I also have this quote from Hillary Clinton saying, "Showcasing favorite cuisines, ceremonies, and values is an often overlooked and powerful tool of diplomacy. The meals that I share with my counterparts at home and abroad cultivate a stronger cultural understanding between countries and offer a unique setting to enhance the formal diplomacy we conduct every day." And that's exactly what I think, that public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy and culinary diplomacy can all work together to fill in the gaps that politicians don't have time to do. So when we talk, and if you do a little bit of research on Google about culinary diplomacy, or gastro diplomacy, or gastronomic diplomacy, as it's sometimes called, you'll see a lot of mention about Greece, maybe, and Rome in terms of its origins. But it's really, we can look back since the beginning of time. And ever since nomadic tribes were wandering around, culinary diplomacy was in effect because they had to work with one another to establish trade and to kind of barter and negotiate security between the tribes, and they would do that through food. In addition to being something that fills our stomach, throughout history, food was also a form of currency. Wheat was worth its weight in gold, spices were traded as a very valuable commodity, and many, many other foods were chocolate and coffee and the things that we love so much today were literally forms of currency in ancient times. So people not only exchanged recipes, but they were exchanging money by giving food back and forth. And some of the culinary trends that we see in Central Asia and in the Middle East, for example, today, date back all the way to these Bedouin times. Because if you were a nomad or a Bedouin and you were traveling around and you had, sheep or mutton with you or different types of animals, you couldn't afford to slaughter them on a daily basis to eat every day with a meal. Your daily meal would consist of milk and yogurt and cheese and fruits and vegetables and things like that. And the only time that you would sacrifice an animal would be to honor a guest who was really distinguished or for a special holiday. And so that started a trend of meat being something that you do to honor somebody and something that's served on special occasions. So it still holds a very special place in many cultures because of this tradition. And I looked online and I saw some of the people from the different places that they're going to be coming to Utah, and one of them was Jordan. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this dish called mansaf, because mansaf is a wonderful dish that has Bedouin origins. This is very popular even in cosmopolitan Amman today. And this is a piece of Palestinian embroidery work that actually shows women traditionally making mansaf. And what it is a big layered dish that the community would get together and make with roasted lamb or mutton and rice and a very thick, delicious yogurt sauce. And this is a national treasure of Jordan. So if people come from that part of the world and come here, that's a dish that you could bring up to them, and you can see the sparkle in their eyes as you talk about it. I also want to talk about some of the little success stories in culinary diplomacy throughout history. There are many, and we could talk for the whole semester on this, but these are just some highlights. Hatshepsut was Egypt's female pharaoh from 1478, before the Common Era. And a lot of people are surprised to learn that long before the Greek and the Roman Empire, she was reestablishing lost relations in the land of Punt, which is modern-day Djibouti and Yemen and Ethiopia and Somalia, and actually developing trade with them and often sharing culinary recipes and also ingredients. And we know this because if we go to her tomb in Luxor, we can see before the tomb they have a tree that was actually given to her by the people of Punt that was planted there, that still exists today, that's still growing. And we have many different depictions showing this type of thing. So wherever there is a lot of trade and a lot of great things going on, there are also more peaceful relations. And she had a peaceful reign. And then something very interesting as we look at tablescapes, and for any of you who are into protocol or into menu planning or even catering, or you like to go that extra mile when you're at home and setting tables, there's so much symbolism that we can do when we do something simple like decorate a table. And Cleopatra actually gives us a lot of great examples of that. because when she was with Mark Antony, they coined themselves as the inimitable livers, meaning nobody else could imitate their lifestyle. They had the top, lifestyle. So they would send these fleets out all over the world, long before the Roman emperors did it, and really to try to cultivate all of the best products and all of the best ingredients from all around the world and to procure them. And when they would serve them on their tables, she would make sure that on her table in Alexandria, she always had papyrus flowers and lotus flowers. And sometimes the centerpieces would go a little bit heavy on the lotus flowers. So you're thinking, big deal, maybe she liked lotus flowers. But there is symbolism in this, because the lotus was the flower of southern Egypt, and the papyrus was the symbol of northern Egypt. So she was in northern Egypt, throwing all of these lotus flowers around, meaning that she also reigned over southern Egypt and that she was planning on unifying northern and southern Egypt under her reign. So a great idea of symbolism between the two. And I wanted to share with you, before I get any deeper into the conversation, a little bit about how I started, because it's obviously not a direct career path. And the term culinary diplomat can be used for many, many different things. I often use the term when I describe chefs who do a great job of interpreting the cuisine of their particular culture, and therefore showcasing their culture through their food. But in my path, I got started by my blog, which Warren mentioned a little bit earlier. In the beginning, it was called Dining with Diplomats. Now it's called Amy Riolo. But when I started, it was actually at the suggestion of my first editor, who said, "You're a writer, you need to have a blog." And she said, "I noticed you mentioned that you spent a lot of time at embassies and sometimes with royalty." She said, "I think that would be interesting for people to read about." And I said, "Okay, so I'll just cover what I did." So my very first entry in 2009 was with the ambassador's wife of Djibouti. And since then, I went on to cover other countries like Libya and Central African Republic and Benin, and of course, Italy and France and places that we're familiar with, but many countries that we're not so familiar with. And I use the blog as really my way of translating their culture or even a specific dish to Americans. And so if you're ever looking for a recipe, you can always turn to the blog and just type in the name of the country in the little search box, and you may find a recipe from that country. And then, as Warren also mentioned, I worked for the Sister Cities. I chaired the Baltimore, Luxor, Alexandria Sister City Committee for quite some time. And that led me to Egypt for months at a time. And I would be working with many different people in leading government and cultural exchanges and also culinary exchanges, doing restaurant consulting. I worked at the Egyptian embassy in Washington for a while. And as I started doing these dinners, kind of word got out. And then I would be able to work as a consultant for other embassies or other different universities, cultural groups, whenever they needed help. And so this was an event that I worked at the Egyptian residence under Ambassador Sama Shokri, and he actually came here and was a speaker here at one time also. So this was a dinner with his wife and Andrew Zimmern when we were shooting a channel special for the Embassy Row program that they did. And then I have my books. Of course, I always say that through my books and my classes and my lectures, it's not enough that I talk about the recipes of a country, but also that people are able to understand the people behind them at the same time. So I was dubbed the cook to the kings by a Cairo newspaper for a lot of the work I've done on the diplomatic fronts. And when Prince William was getting married, CNN.com actually asked me to propose a menu along with 4 Michelin star chefs from different restaurants around the world. And I'll share that with you later, because I think the nostalgia and the planning that went into it could be interpreted into any meal. And it's really fun to see kind of what is possible in a dinner. How many statements can you make about your own personal statements and interests, about your town, about your state, about your culture, about politics. A meal can cover a lot of topics, and we're going to talk about all of those. And also some of the events that I did at different places. So highlights from some of this year's event. In Washington, D.C., we have something called Cultural Tourism DC, which has an Embassy Chef Challenge. So the photo on the left is from that. I've been a judge in that for the last few years. And then over on the right, I was at your counterparts in LA a few months ago for the International Visitors Program of LA, and did this particular program with them in conjunction with the Italy America Chamber of Commerce. So it was on gastrodiplomacy, but it was specifically speaking to the Italian influences. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about some very simple foods that we often take for granted and their role in diplomacy that they've had in the world. And I think if we look back to the 9th century and we think about some very everyday foods and how they were successful in bridging different cultures, we can do it much more easily than they can with all of the technology and all of the great food and all of the knowledge and the wonderful modern travel arrangements that we can make. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Fatimid Caliphate that took place in the 9th century. They were from an area which is now modern-day Tunisia, and they ruled much of the Mediterranean during the 9th century. They founded Palermo 50 years before they claimed Palermo 50 years before they founded Cairo and claimed that as their capital. So they had a very wide span of influence. And in the Mediterranean at that time, there were predominantly the three monotheistic faiths. They had people of the Jewish faith, Muslims, and also Christians. Now the Fatimids were a Shiite sect, and they were ruling in a predominantly Sunni area. So they had a lot of, potentially hostile environment that they could cover, and they really wanted to make bridge building an important part of their focus. So food and religious and culinary kind of festivities were their thing. And they said, if we can reinstate a lot of these fun festivals that were taking place before Christianity and kind of the pagan times, and introduce them as state festivals, say that they have, nothing to do with religion, we'll get everyone to come out. Well then, in Egypt, there's something that they call moulids, which I have written above the sweets up there. Moulids are birth celebrations. So in Egypt, they have moulids for the Virgin Mary, for Christians. They have them for the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, for Muslims. And they have it for one Jewish saint also. So the different communities would get together and celebrate their festivities. And the Fatimids really wanted all the religions to be out celebrating together, whether or not they believed or practiced their religion. They just wanted people to show up. They would string lights all around the Nile or all around the Mediterranean in their different areas and encourage people to come out and to do this. And one of the things that they did were to make these sweets. So if you look at them, they look like the sesame candies that you may be familiar with, or nougats. There are a lot of those nut candies, torrone we call them in Italy, or torron in Spain. You'll see them at Christmas time. And this is all the influence of the Fatimid, because as they reintroduce those festivals, they reintroduce these sweets. And now they're common all throughout the Mediterranean. Nobody knows exactly why, but this is the hand that they had in doing this. And also one of the neat things that they did was the caliphs at Christmas time used to the Muslim caliphs would give gifts to the Christian priests, and they would also give them big trays of fish and a special kind of donuts. So if you go to many places in the Mediterranean, namely southern Italy, have any of you ever heard of the Feast of the Seven Fishes? Okay, so this is how that got to be famous. Fish never had that kind of sacrificial, we're only doing this because it's Lent kind of a thing in Italy. It was always seen as a celebratory food, even though it was a little bit more plentiful than, say, meat. So this is one of the reasons why, because the Fatimids had claim in that area and they would give it as a gift to the priests, the idea of serving fish at this time became synonymous with Christmas, and the donuts fused with strufoli and zeppole and many of those other issues that they have in southern Italy. And there are, many wonderful tips that we can use to build bridges at our own table. And we talk about building bridges across cultures, but sometimes we have work to do within our own families, or with our extended families, or with our neighbors. And so the sky's the limit. And I think some of the things that we're going to talk a little bit tonight are just about being good hosts in general, tips and etiquette from different countries. And one of the things I like to tell people is sometimes we inquire what people can't eat in advance. Well, what about if we inquire about what they like to eat? I think that's you're setting yourself up for success, because maybe there's 2 things that they can eat, but there are more things that they like to eat, and they may be things which you also like to eat or have a specific story to tell, and can really open up conversation and set the table for a much more pleasurable experience. And also a chance to share your own culture. We look at it a lot of times as an intimidating thing. It's like, what am I going to cook for the guests that are coming? But it's really the chance to show a platform of things that you can't get in a restaurant. Or, is there a memory in your life of a great vacation that you'd like to share with people? This is the time to be able to do that, because it opens up conversation at the same time as the meal. And I have a funny story about inquiring in advance about what people should eat. I just, recently started doing that myself. And it was because I was on the plane and I was going to LA, and I was sitting next to some Buddhist monks. And we struck a conversation. They had wonderful energy. They had their garb on. They were telling me all about Buddhism and their concepts of the afterlife and things like that. And they found out what I did. And I said, I'm going to LA and I'm going to be talking about gastrodiplomacy, and I'm Italian, and these are the foods. They said, oh, we were just in Italy. We met the Pope. And they whipped out their picture with the Pope, and we were talking about lasagna. It was a wonderful conversation. But we never ate. And everybody was like scared to bring the food out. So I noticed they weren't eating. So I said, well, maybe they're fasting. Maybe it's like a religious fast. So I can't eat because the smell will, maybe bother them, and I didn't want to offend anybody. So I said, I'm not going to eat, but I was starving. So they didn't eat either. The whole time we're talking, nobody ate. We get off the plane and they reached under their seat and they pulled out this paper bag and they said, do you know what this is? And I said, no. They said, these are burgers from Five Guys. When we found out what you did, we were so embarrassed to eat in front of you that we wouldn't eat them. And I said, well, look, I'm starving. I would have joined you, but I thought you were on a fast. So, lesson, don't assume with food, and ask. I've never heard of a culture that thinks it's rude if you ask what they like to eat. Any, I think, human being would be honored that you care, and it's just such, if they like cheese, maybe you've got some great cheese, and it makes it much, much easier for people. So food etiquette is based on many factors: history, religion, social status, education, personal taste, family tradition, and geography. All go into etiquette. And that word etiquette is just so intense and it scares so many people. But what I like to say is, I don't look as much at what not to do as what you should do. Because there might be fun things that you can do, and you're having a great time. And then even if you make a mistake, no one cares, because you're having such a great time that they know you're from a different culture, and everybody makes concessions, hopefully, for people of other different cultures. I've had them made for me many times. A story that I have about that is, in Egypt, you always, in many Arab countries, you have to refuse someone who's offering you something 3 times. So, they offer you something, you say no thank you, because you don't want to be rude. Then they offer it again, and you say no thank you. They have to insist a 3rd time before you can take it. So, I got used to it and I was doing it. But one time they offered me this delicious sweet, which is made out of semolina and a sweet syrup. It's called basbousa. And you might remember something similar from Jeddah, the harissa. So they served this, and I said, I love it. I knew I loved it, so I took it right away. And I caught myself off guard. And the person who offered it to me burst out laughing because he knew that I knew better, but at the same time, I just couldn't resist. So, it's okay sometimes. It causes a good laugh. So in the Arab world, there's a saying that the food equals the affection. I'm going to talk a lot about the Arab world because I saw that you have a lot of people coming from the Middle East, and I think that will really speak to that. There's not a lot of readily available about what to do with the Arab world. I know there's a lot of what not to do, but there's not a lot of what to do. So the food equals the affection. In any of these 21 countries that speak Arabic, the more people revere you if you go to their house, the more they will put out in front of you. And so if any people from that part of the world come, that's a good thing to do. As Americans, and even as chefs, we really pride ourselves on not having a lot of waste. And we try to prepare the meal so that it will be exactly enough for what people need. But if you have people from the Middle East, one simple little tip would be to put out much more than you normally would, and you'll be seen as hospitable. Some of the tips, again, always insist that your host offers you many times something to eat, and if you were the host, you would offer many times. So if someone came to your home and you're offering them a glass of water or a glass of tea, would you like something to drink? They're going to say no. Let me get you some tea. No, that's okay. Let me give you some water. No, that's okay. And then you come out with a tray of tea and water, or whatever you have, and you set it in front of the person, and they will take it. Then they will take it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Eating and drinking with the right hand only is considered to be etiquette. And if you can leave some extra food on your plate, because if the person eats everything, it means that they want more. If you finish everything, it means you haven't had enough. If you leave something, it means that they fed you enough. Some of the things to avoid, I had to do an article on this for the Wall Street Journal a while back. Staring at people's food, because staring at anything, it goes to more than just food. If you stare, it means you want something. It's very rude, so you don't want to do that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about table settings. Of course, in your own home, you are free, and it's more advisable to do what you normally do, because then people can experience the American style. But if you go to someone else's home, you might see, or you live in a different part of the world, you might see how they entertain. And a lot of people traditionally in the Arab world will have a table setting like this spread out on the floor. So you have to remember, people take their shoes off at the door. They don't have animals running around in the home. They have very clean carpets, and then they set out another clean carpet on top of the floor with a tablecloth on top of that and put the food down that way. And so people usually sit Indian style and eat the food. And the first time I did it, it was really uncomfortable. I wasn't used to it, and it felt weird. But after I kind of got over it and got used to it, I really liked it, because there are conversations that you can have sitting Indian style on the floor that you cannot have sitting upright at a table. So if you ever have the opportunity, don't be scared or don't be shy. It's really fun. But the other thing I wanted to point out at the table, and you will find this also even on tables, in many, especially in cosmopolitan areas, people eat on tables. And when they have foreign guests, they will always eat on tables, no matter what they do in their own family personal time. But they set the table this way, where the main dish is in the middle, and then they have the little pilot dishes on the side, and then they have all the little sides all around, and they're offered within arm's reach of every person, because people don't reach and people don't pass dishes. So if you ever have guests at your home and they come from a culture where it might not be a passing culture, and you see they're kind of shy to do that, if you pass dishes, you could let people know, in the United States, this is kind of what we do, and it's okay to pass, and let me give you something, or whatever you do in your own home. But this is very kind of de rigueur in the Middle East, is to have everything within your reach. And if someone really likes you when you go to dinner, even if you're just two people and you're sitting across from them, they will keep pushing the food closer to you, in front of you, just another subtle hint to get you to eat. And tea. Tea is very, very important in the Middle East. It was the predecessor to coffee, so they had it for many, many years, and it's the national drink in many places. And when you go somewhere, you are always offered tea. Before you go, when you leave, it's just tea is the go-to drink for many, many people. And there's a funny story that I have in my Arabian Delights book about the young man in the market, or in the souk. He would go to the market every day, and he would always pass by this older gentleman in his stall. And every time he passed by the man never greeted him. And it's very rude in their culture not to greet. So he kept walking by, and he would greet the man, and the man would never respond. So finally, after about a month, he stopped, and he said to the old man, I pass you by every day, and it's our custom that you greet me, and you never greet me. What do you have to lose? And the old man took a long sigh, and he said, well, son, he said, if I greet you as our custom dictates, then I will have to offer you a cup of tea as our custom dictates. And in order to offer you the tea, I'll have to invite you into my home, as our custom dictates. And then my daughter will make the tea for you. He said, and when my daughter comes out and serves you the tea, and you see how beautiful she is, you're surely going to want to ask for her hand in marriage. He said, so you see, my son, I do have a lot of things to lose by saying hello to you. And they never said hello to each other. They passed each other every day, but they never said hello after that. So tea is very important. I also wanted to show this map because a lot of times Islam and Muslims and Arabs get all lumped together. But of course, we know there are many Arabs who are non-Muslim, and there are many Muslim who are not Arabs. So this is a map of the world that shows the Muslim influence, down to the countries with the least percentage in yellow, but still they're definitely not Arab-speaking countries. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Islam and the interpretation of it, so that you're aware, for those of you who aren't already, of what is permissible and not permissible. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about people's personal preferences and how they make choices when they travel. Someone could be Muslim from a Muslim country and come to the United States and sit with you at your table at home and be very comfortable drinking wine. However, they will never tell you that in advance because it's not socially acceptable where they're from. And that's typical of everybody. I'm sure that you have people here within the Mormon faith who practice in different ways. And the other cultures are very, very similar. So some of the things that go into affecting the food culture in Islam are, of course, the 5 pillars. So we have the Shahada, which is a declaration of faith, and that's declaring that the Prophet Muhammad is the last and final messenger, and that the person believes in only one God. And then we have the Salat, or the prayer, and people pray within 5 prescribed times of the day, those who are truly following the religion. And then we have fasting during the month of Ramadan, but also during other times as well, special days. Some people I know fast 2 days a week, Mondays and Thursdays. And then we have zakat, or charity. The tithing is very important in Islam, and there are particular types of charity that they're supposed to give, and they often give food as charity at different times of the year as holiday. And then we have the pilgrimage to Mecca, or the Hajj. So if you look at this in terms of food, what you will say is, generally the things that are off limits, of course, are pork and alcohol. But there are many other ways that food is enjoyed because of this as a result. Even though people don't drink, they have a wonderful non-alcoholic cocktails that they do. And they have a very extensive repertoire with spices and with sweets and with incense even, that people maybe in other cultures aren't quite so used to. Prayer is important because in terms of meal times, people who follow the prayers also eat in accordance with the prayers. It's not written anywhere, it's not mandated, but nobody would ever have lunch before the Zohr, or the afternoon prayer. It's just not done. And dinner usually isn't done until at least after Maghrib, or the sunset prayer, even when people are fasting or not. It's just culturally what they do. If you're in that part of the world, people set up meetings at those different times of day. They'll tell you, if you have a business meeting, they're not going to say, I'll see you at 3:15. They'll say, I'll see you after the Asr prayer, which is the mid-afternoon. So you have to be cognizant of when the mid-afternoon prayer is in order to be able to keep your appointments. Some of the customs on eating are people who are practicing would always wash their hand immediately before and after the meal. They would actually go to the restroom and wash their hand. That's very important. They would always they would always wait to be asked to eat. And they usually eat quickly without a lot of conversation at the table, and then pull back and go to another area and enjoy coffee or tea. And that's when they would sit and talk. So the meal could be quite quick, maybe even 15 minutes, but the tea and the coffee afterwards could last 3 to 4 to 5 hours. It's considered rude to lay down and improper or like lounge back when you're seating. And there's usually it's usually the meal is started in the name of God and ended with a thanks to God. So they're just some general Muslim things, even for other countries. And of course, people do them in different degrees. And as people go into other people's homes, they also make concessions and may not do the same things that they would do in their own home because they're realizing that they're in a host's home. I also want to talk a little bit about Ukraine because I know there are people involved in the program from Ukraine. So here, table manners are pretty much continental. And it's also a place where you don't want to begin until the host invites you to eat. A lot of things about keeping your hands visible while you're eating and like the wrists on the table. Oldest members are usually served first. And it's advisable to try everything because it's kind of rude to refuse a dish there. And second helpings are often encouraged. There's also a whole drinking culture, of course, with vodka. And there's a special toasting that usually goes on whenever 3 or more people take place in a meal. And usually the guest of honor would give the toast, and then later on, the host would give the toast, and then later on the guest of honor would also make a toast. And it's considered rude to click your glasses if they're not filled with an alcoholic beverage. Glasses are usually filled no more than 2/3 fill, and you're not supposed to refill your own glass. Also, no empty bottles on the table, and it's considered rude to pour or not good taste to pour wine backhanded. So some very specific rules there. And then if we go forward to China, usually very nice, a good idea to bring small gifts or a good wine as a gift when you're going to somewhere for dinner. And obviously the value of the dish has to do a lot with the relationship with the host. People usually dress up a little bit more and are more punctual. And you would introduce yourself upon arrival and then let the host take over and introduce you from there. Elders are also respected and served first, and usually the meal would start after the host mentions, please enjoy yourself. Hosts would place usually dishes on the table in a specific manner, with the main course being in the center, just like we saw in the Middle Eastern table spread. And then all of the other dishes would be placed around them. And usually the main dish is prepared in a decorative way, and the most focal part of the decorative piece would be facing the guest of honor. Here are some different etiquette tips from Japan. I don't speak Japanese, so I will, if anybody knows that, you can feel free to pronounce. But usually it's considered polite to say, I gratefully receive, before you start a meal. And Beth actually mentioned that at our lunch today because she spent some time in Japan. It's also something you want to avoid pouring your own drink. And when drinking soup, you always want to lift the bowl and tilt it kind of towards your mouth. You never eat sushi in more than one bite. And when dipping the sushi, when sharing in kind of a communal area in the soy sauce, you always want to flip your chopsticks around so that you're grabbing the food from the communal plate with the opposite end of the chopsticks than what you're actually eating from. You don't mix the soy and the wasabi, and you never raise your food to an area above your mouth. It is proper to clean your plate and to finish the last morsel in Japan. And then at the end, you always give thanks for the meal to the host. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about national dishes. And I'm going to talk a lot about my success stories, so I also want to talk about what I consider to be my learning experiences with food. Sometimes we have really good intentions, and they fall flat, we fall flat on our face because we don't always realize some of the emotionally charged things that are behind a lot of foods. And when you're dealing with diplomacy, it's really, really important. So national dishes are really hard. Unless, it states die hard somewhere that it is a national dish, I would really avoid using that term. In terms of food history and culinary anthropology, when I talk about different dishes, I don't even usually like to say, this is a dish from Syria, or this is an Egyptian dish, or this is a Moroccan dish. I would much rather say it came from a region, or if I can pinpoint that it was influenced by an empire like the Phoenicians, or the Romans, or the Greeks, or the Ottomans. I would much rather say that, because their territories were so large that, of course, they crossed over a lot of our nationalistic borders today. So people share many foods. So just as you can build bridges with food by calling a food a dish of a specific country that actually belongs to many countries, you can also break down those bridges really, really fast. And it becomes fighting terms for people. So this is a dish called shakshuka. It's very, very popular in Israel. And it originally hails from Tunisia. Some of the immigrants that went to Israel brought the dish with them. And you can find this dish in Libya, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and of course in Israel today. Well, in my cookbook, the latest one, the Ultimate Mediterranean Diet Cookbook, I actually use a recipe from Israel, so I call it Israeli shakshuka. But when I went to post it on Facebook, I got lots of interesting responses, because every country that had that shakshuka in their culture was upset that I gave another country credit for their dish. But that was not my intention. Sometimes cookbook authors, where we learn something, that's where we state it from. So I would give that as a little word of caution. Dishes, spread many places, and many people share them, and it's fun to be as inclusive as possible. And it is advisable. Now here's someone who did a lot of blunders, as we all know about Marie Antoinette and let them eat cake. It was actually, for our French professor, it was actually let them eat brioche. It wasn't cake, but still, it was a wheat-based product. But what Marie Antoinette never gets credit for was popularizing the potato. All of the great French potato-based recipes would not exist if it were not Marie Antoinette, because potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, all of those, and corn were New World ingredients, and they didn't come to Europe until after Columbus. So when they arrived, they a lot of times were looked at with suspicion. And when people started using them, they didn't really know how to. So in potatoes, during her reign in France, they were basically prison food. So people looked at potato-based recipes and thought of them as gruel. Nobody wanted to eat them. So she started a campaign where she used to wear a potato bud flower in her hair and promoted potato recipes. And she actually made them become vogue. And she would make her husband, the king, also wear a potato flower in his lapel. And that's how they promoted the use of potatoes. So leaders have a lot of say in what's fashionable and what we eat, as do celebrities. And as a result, inadvertently, culinary diplomacy. So this is the article about the menu that I had to do. You can Google it, or it's on my website, for Prince William. And it talks a little bit about the chefs and what we would promote for his, or propose for his menu. So some of the things that I look at when I plan meals, and this is another one that we did at the Egyptian residence. And this was a lecture that I gave on Egyptian influences on American architecture. And we had these tables set up like this at the residence, and we named each one of them with a different Egyptian, famous person in history. So this was a table called Cleopatra, and we had little menus made out of papyrus with all of the different images on them. And then we had a traditional Egyptian, but done in a very elevated style menu. And this was a very well-attended event for an organization called Club One, which is made up of a lot of, for example, the First Lady and a lot of ambassadors' wives, and people like that were in attendance, and it was wonderful. So these are some of the things that I look at: setting the mood and a common theme, finding common denominator foods. If you've already asked what people like, and you know the other people that are coming to dinner, then you can have a great idea of what foods they all have in common, because it's really nice. It gets harder and harder as time goes on. Between food allergies and religious restrictions and what's available at the market, it can become more and more tricky. But if you have some common denominator foods, you're setting yourself up for success, because everybody's eating the same plate. There's nothing worse than having a diplomatic event and the key players can't eat. And I learned this when there was a Washington chef, actually, who planned a state dinner, and the king of Saudi Arabia was coming, and 2 Israeli rabbis were coming, and he made pork for the main entree with no other options. So, you think somebody would know better, but they don't always know better. So common denominator foods are great. Also to choose things that are nostalgic or significant. If you know someone comes from a specific culture, and you know that they're famous for their yogurt, or they're famous for their bread, or they're famous for their cheese, and you have some of those things on the table, it will give them something to talk about. It will give them like a little piece of home at the table, and it makes everybody more happy. And then, of course, comforting foods. A lot of times when we go to host people, we want to get really fancy. But I think we should do just the opposite, no matter who's the guest, is to have really comforting foods, because that is what, at the end of the day, makes people feel better and makes people more comfortable. So this is part of the menu that I had. It's just in basic font, but these are some of the dishes. And I'll go through explaining a little bit why I chose them, because you can then see the symbolism behind it and what's possible in a meal. So poached quail eggs over asparagus puree on British country olive bread. Quail eggs are said to be one of Prince William's favorite. Asparagus puree, because asparagus was in season. British country olive bread, because we're promoting things that are British because of who we're cooking for. Both he and Kate love cheese pizzas, so individual fire-baked cheese pizzas, but we're doing them with all British cheeses and really quality artisan cheeses that they have to talk about. Mini spinach and spring onion frittata hearts with herbed mascarpone cream. This is a spin-off of a frittata that they do actually in the Arabian Peninsula that's wonderful, that they do with Swiss chard. And I said, I was served it in a palace there, so I said, well, why don't we do the same thing, but apply it to some of the British ingredients. It's very elegant. We'll make it into hearts because it's a wedding. She loves Thai, he loves venison, so I came up with handcrafted venison sausage pot stickers with Thai peanut dipping sauce. Jersey Royal new potato roasties, because Jersey Royal potatoes are an important agricultural crop in England, and roasties are a delicious little elegant way to showcase these ingredients. And then I paired each dish with not only a wine, but also with a non-alcoholic alternative for all of the guests who didn't drink. And I wanted the non-alcoholic drink to be just as special as the wine. So the wine might have an interesting vintage, it might come from a different place. Also, the palate matches really well with the profile of the food, and I wanted the non-alcoholic drink to do the same thing. Then I had this appetizer, seasonal things, again, with the local cheese and with rocket, which is arugula in Britain, paired with the two different things. And then for the first course, I have an Italian dish called corzetti, which are a special kind of ravioli that they make with a special stamp that have beautiful design in them in the Liguria region. So I said, wouldn't it be cool, instead of using the Italian stamp, if we do the British coat of arms, and that's their stamp on the corzetti for the first course. And of course with porcini and truffles because of the connotations of those. And then for the intermezzo, we have a passion fruit sorbet as a palate cleanser. Venison medallions again, because he loved venison. Our Jersey potatoes, but this time mixed with truffles and made into croquettes. Kenyan style kale, because he proposed to her in Kenya. So I wanted to have little elements of Kenya there so that they would have this, not only a global presence, but also be able to talk about their story. Here are some of the breads. Each one of them has something to do with their personal story, made into a heart. The nigella seed is called the blessed seed in the Middle East, so I wanted to have that there. And the salads, also very local. I purposely didn't put any citrus in the salad because I wanted to be able to pair it with wine. And in the Italian tradition, whenever you have a citrus or acid in a salad, you don't pair it with a wine. And I put Egyptian hibiscus punch because she is a big fan of Egypt and spent a lot of time there. So I wanted to give a nod to that as well. The cheese plate, of course, we have a lot of British cheeses. And then a wonderful rose water and mint-infused fruit salad that's in my Arabian Delights book that I was served at a palace in Saudi Arabia that's absolutely delicious. And then many, many different things, as you can see, for dessert. So the top is the traditional, sort of the seated dessert. And they also created a dessert bar out of some of their favorite dishes, like his banana chocolate cake, also the Persian love cake, which has a lot of symbolism, some British things. She loves chocolate, so I wanted to have the chocolate fountain there. But because they're royalty and leaders and the statement that they can make in the world, I wanted to offer a single estate chocolate because I promote fair trade chocolate. As you know, there are a lot of not so pleasant things that go on in the chocolate industry. But by buying fair trade, we can make sure that those don't happen. So Amade is really known for that. And then I also have a Kenyan confectioner stand, again, to bring in a little bit of Kenya. A gelato stand because they love gelato. Cookie table with lots of symbolism in there. And then the edible favor was Cleopatra's Kisses. So this is a recipe that I have in my second cookbook, Nile Style, which is translated from hieroglyphs, again in a nod to her love to Egypt, but it said that Cleopatra used to feed these to Mark Antony. So I thought that's a romantic favor to have at a wedding. So that was a little bit of the symbolism that I put in there, but I put that same symbolism into each and every menu that I do, because I think that there's just so much that we can, emotion, and there's so much goodwill that we can promote with a menu. So I want to talk a little bit about the differences between halal and kosher, because this comes up a lot when we're hosting people of different cultures. And as I mentioned earlier, the big disclaimer is people practiced to different degrees. So when you're working with embassies or with state dinners or when you're hosting people in your home, it's important to know. But again, keep in mind, a lot of times people don't feel comfortable discussing it, because if you ask someone who's, for example, from a Muslim country, do you drink wine or do you do this or do that, and if they admit to it, it's like admitting to you that they don't practice, which might be shameful for them. So they might not ever come out and say that. The same, a lot of times with people who keep kosher, there are many different degrees of that. Some people will not eat anything unless it's prepared in a kosher kitchen, which they have special caterers for, and you have to get meal from the outside because they don't want any of the utensils or anything to touch a non-kosher kitchen. Other people are like, okay, I just don't eat pork. Some people are, in the middle of the road where they don't eat pork or shellfish and they don't mix milk with things. So it's people, everybody has luckily the freedom in this country to choose what they want to do, and they do different things with it. So I want to just give the guidelines so people are familiar. That way if they say I'm halal or say I'm kosher, you kind of know where your boundaries are. The word halal means permissible in Arabic. So it doesn't just describe food, but any action which is actually permissible. And within food, other than pork and alcohol, if you're talking about meat, it's something which has had the name of God pronounced upon it when it was slaughtered. It actually has to be slaughtered in the quickest, most humane way possible not to minimize suffering, and the blood has to be drained from it. So this is halal. People who keep halal, if there's no halal meat present, they can eat kosher meat, because the kosher meat also has the name of God pronounced on it, and many people will do that as well. Things that are haram, like pork and alcohol, are not permissible in Islam. Kosher are the things, of course, that conform to the Jewish rules. Now, within the butchering traditions, there are a lot of things, parts of the animal, which are not kosher, that are halal. So people who keep kosher would not eat halal meat and think that it's okay, because they might use like the legs of the animal or certain parts that people who keep kosher do not. So that's an important distinction to make. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about seafood and about fish especially. Fish is a good alternative if you're just not sure whether people really keep halal or how kosher they are, and they don't give you a lot of directive. To have a vegetarian or a fish option on hand, you're safe with everybody. If it's a Muslim community, you can do all seafood and they will eat it. But of course, a lot of people in the Jewish faith don't eat shellfish, so you want to just have regular fish for them. And of course, the vegetarian option is wonderful. Sometimes there is, and I learned this is one of the other things that I learned the hard way, people from the Middle East, because the meat has such a wonderful connotation to them, and it's seen as something that you give to guests. If someone arrives to your home and you purposely did not serve them meat, and they didn't have a lot of outside exposure with the world, they might be offended, because they might think that you didn't think highly enough of them to purchase meat, or that you didn't want to spend that much money on them, or that they don't deserve it. So in that case, if you didn't buy meat because you don't have halal meat, you could certainly say, I was concerned that you followed, the halal rules, and I didn't want to offend you, so that's why I don't have, meat at this table, because we didn't have any available, and let them know that that was the reason why. I would say that up front. One time I had an Egyptian guest. It was very early on in my entertaining Egyptian stage, and I made a dish called kushari, which is a wonderful dish of layered rice and pasta and a spicy tomato sauce with fried onions on top. It's great. It's vegetarian, but the guest who came, really, after someone else told me, I think he was a little bit offended that you didn't have meat on the table. And I said I thought he would think it was great that I made kushari, but later on I learned, to have meat as often as possible. I also want to talk a little about Buddhism, because there is a great deal of conflict here between the type of meats that are served and not served and avoided in vegetarianism than what we talked about in the Middle East. And so it's good to know that as well. Monks and believers are traditionally vegetarianism, so it's very safe to go vegetarian if you're ever entertaining people. Whether they practice or not, they will still appreciate that. And it's because they're based on the Dharmic concepts of nonviolence. Monks are vegetarian year-round, but other people are just vegetarian sometimes for different parts of the year. Other believers think that meat consumption is okay, like my fellow traveling companions that were with me that day to LA. They thought meat was okay as long as it wasn't sacrificed in their honor. So as the Muslims and Arabs will sacrifice meat in your honor as a term of respect, it would be an offense to Buddhists. So here are some of the different Dharmic faiths and their variances within the food that they eat. In Hinduism, traditionally, beef is off limits. There are many vegetarian sects, but nowadays, about 67% actually eat meat and seafood. So you can always play it safe with vegetarianism, but if you inquire and people tell you that they eat meat, then you're safe. Jainism, which is a little bit more unheard of by a lot of people in the States, is actually, they take the dharmic concept very, very literally in terms of nonviolence. So they're very concerned not only about killing animals, but also plants and trees and how we uproot things from the earth. So they don't eat things like potatoes and onions and garlic because they don't want to disrupt the ecosystem by pulling them out of the earth. They only take things that come from trees or vegetables that grow well enough the ground that they don't have to hurt any roots or anything of the earth in order to eat. And a lot of, again, the younger generation there are many Jains in the Washington, D.C. area, so I'm familiar with them. A lot of the younger generation don't follow to the letter, but many of the older generation are very, very strict. And I actually had a colleague who owned an Indian restaurant that served only food that prescribed to Jainism. And then, of course, there's Sikhism. So the temples in the Sikhs only serve vegetarian food, but then outside, people are a little bit more free to eat what they want, but they also avoid the ritually slaughtered meat. And then there's Taoism that also promotes vegetarianism and fasting at various times. So some of the additional resources that I have for everybody are, of course, my blog, amyriolo.blogspot.com. I'm on all forms of social media, and you're welcome to reach out or send me an email if you have any topics of concern later. There are 2 specific lectures I would love for you to see if you have time. They are on the Library of Congress website and also on my YouTube channel and my website. They're Cuisine and Culture of the Arab World and Understanding Egyptian Cuisine and Culture, because they go much more in depth with those parts of the world than I was able to talk to today, and they might be of interest to you. I wanted to mention a little about tonight's menu, which was great. It was really Middle Eastern fusion, because there are a lot of Middle Eastern dishes, but they're not things that would be paired together that way necessarily in the Middle East. So they had the falafel, they had the cumin and the yogurt and the pickled vegetable sauce, but also the labneh with the garlic herb grilled pita. So labneh is a traditional strained yogurt that comes from the Levantine region. So what is now modern day Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Israel, Jordan, they eat labneh. And the country Lebanon is actually named after labneh. That's how important this product is to them. So it's eaten at breakfast time, usually. It's eaten with appetizers, and it's a very common food. And it's one of the foods that would have been around since nomadic times, since the Bedouins. So it has a great history to it. And then we had the za'atar grilled chicken. So za'atar is wild thyme in Arabic. That's what that means. But there's also a spice mix called za'atar, which has wild thyme, sumac, sea salt, sometimes a little bit of ground coriander, and maybe even ground peanuts in it. And then they serve it with vegetable couscous, which is funny because couscous, of course, comes from the Maghreb area, like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, that area. And they don't usually use za'atar in that part. So it's a fusion by mixing them together. Now, there is couscous, of course, in Israel, which is a larger grain. And what they call that in the Levantine area is magrubeya. So they call it Israeli couscous in Israel, but magrubeya in the Arab countries. And it's very, very delicious as well. And that would be paired with za'atar. So we went a little bit around the Middle East with that menu, and I haven't tasted it yet, but I'm assuming it's delicious. And for my final thought, no matter what you do when you host people, just remember, this is a famous Chinese proverb that an empty stomach is not a good political advisor. So I thank you all very much, and I'd love to open it up for questions now. Any questions? Comments? Italian, French, Spanish, English, obviously, broken Arabic, and I'm studying Greek. Yes?
Do you know anything about Brazilian cultural culinary traditions?
Anything about Brazilian cultural culinary traditions? Not a ton. I'm not an expert in that area, but I had some Brazilian people on my culinary tour from Istanbul to Athens last year, and so they were sharing quite a bit with me. And they have very different influences in their culture between the different European countries that went and made a difference there, and then with the indigenous culture as well, and all of the meat trends, and then of course the coastal cities with a lot of their seafood. So they have a very vibrant food scene, I think, also that's growing. But I can't speak exactly to their customs and what to do at the table because it's not one of my areas. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Mhm. Oh, that's a great point. So her point is, in Japan, when you give thanks at the end of the meal, she said it's actually for the life. Uh-huh. Oh, so you're giving thanks for the ingredients that you're taking the life of the ingredients. It's beautiful. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned Andrew Zimmer, and I'm wondering what are the most challenging things you've ever eaten in this part of the world?
Well, I'm a pretty safe eater. So I say, like, if I can do it, anybody can do it, because I'm not an adventure eater. And I want to enjoy what I eat, and I want to like it, and I don't want to suffer in any means. I believe food should be pleasurable. So I particularly seek out things that I like. One of the things that I had to get used to in North Africa was pigeon. I wasn't very familiar with eating pigeon before, but they do a lot of that. They raise pigeons there specifically to eat. So I don't think it's too esoteric, but that's probably, for me, that was one of the things. And then there were also things where I had to build up resistance to certain foods because I don't know, some of you may be aware of it, some of our bodies have enzymes which digest certain foods. And people from certain cultures lack certain enzymes sometimes for certain foods. So one of the common ones is cumin, the spice cumin. I just could not handle cumin in the beginning. And the more time you spend in North Africa, I mean, it's a really common ingredient. You have to get used to it. So I used to avoid a lot of things. And then I said, this is ridiculous. I'm like, first of all, I'm missing out on so much. Secondly, it's rude. I'm going to people's homes. I can't eat this. I can't eat that. So I would start putting cumin in my food a little bit at a time and like working up my resistance to it. And that's one of the things that I did to overcome some of the things that I couldn't eat. It's a good question. Yes?
What are some of the things you say about describing the United States food culture?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't get to do that very much unless I'm in like the United Arab Emirates or Egypt, and then I talk about the U.S. A lot about Thanksgiving. If I had to say one thing that I always get asked overseas is Thanksgiving. I once created Thanksgiving for about 22 Italians on May Day, because everyone was off. We were living in Rome, and everybody had May Day off, and they wanted to have a special dinner, and they said, I was going to cook, obviously, and I said, what do you want? And they said, we want Thanksgiving. We've seen it everywhere. So I said, okay. So to procure the turkey in May in Rome, we had to have our vegetarian friend drive 2 hours to Perugia from his butcher connection that actually had turkeys at that time of year, and then I had to go to the gourmet shop to get cranberries, which were in a can. You don't realize cranberries come from here, so not everybody in the world has them. And it was a fun story. Thanksgiving, I get asked that about a lot. But really, I start with Native Americans because I'm really into Native American foodways. There's a lot of great information now in in Washington, D.C., we have the Museum of the American Indian. There's a lot of information about, they always have cooking demonstrations and things from different tribes and different nations. So I go there and I try to learn. And so when I go overseas, I talk first about them. And then I talk about the settlers and when they came and what that did. I talk about our regional differences, and of course about all the different groups that we have living here and what that does to food today, what a traditional meal is, meaning versus what people end up doing at the end of the day because of their schedule and things like that. And people usually love it. American food has a really great reputation around the world, believe it or not. Even though we have, a lot of issues, it's still, people look to us as being leaders in hygiene and its standards and in consistency. A lot of times in, newness and trendiness. So you can go to, posh areas in a lot of places, and they've got like people dressed to the nines sitting in a Cinnabon, eating on a Friday night. It's really funny, and all of a sudden you want Cinnabon, and you're like, well, I don't normally eat Cinnabon in the United States, but I'm picking on that. I'm using them as an example, but it's something that you see. Thank you. Yes.
Amy, is there a way to say no thank you to certain foods? I mean, you're just worried about your ability to really digest it.
Sure.
Is there a way to do that?
I usually say that I have an allergy. If I really just can't do it, I know that's a cop-out, but sometimes you have to, because you don't want to offend people. But if you really can't eat something, I think it's the best way to go is just literally honestly say that you can't eat it, And there are also very creative ways that you can rearrange your food on your plate and cover it with a napkin, pretend like you're eating. I'm kind of an artist at that as well. Yes.
I have a comment rather than a question. I would like to thank you for taking your
Thank you very much. We have a large Ukrainian community in Washington, so it's not hard to learn because it's a vibrant community. Thank you. Yes?
It seems like the idea is to make food that's familiar to you if you're having somebody to your house, but then there's restrictions on making ingredients. So do you just get halal meat and then make something American with it, or?
Oh, sure. If you knew people followed halal and you were able and willing to go to a special butcher for them, that's such a nice thing. Beef stew, a steak, hamburger, whatever you normally would do, it would be, I'm sure, very, very well appreciated. And at lunch today, people were saying, well, when people come, do they want our food? Do they want their food? Do they want some kind of a hybrid? I think for what you're doing for this type of hosting, and you all brought up, you liked seeing what American families do. I think what you normally would do would be the best thing because you can really show them a piece of yourself. And that's what's priceless to people. Yes?
Were you raised, maybe I missed that, and also did you grow up in a very food-conscious home?
Yes, the question was where I was raised and was I raised in a very food-conscious home. I was raised in upstate New York, actually in an area that's considered to be the southern tier near Buffalo. It's called Jamestown, New York. And I moved to the Washington, D.C. area when I was about 15. And then I lived in other places in the world after that. But very, very food-conscious family. We grew a lot of things ourselves. We lived on a dead-end street in the country. It was just my parents and I, and then next door to us was my grandparents. And in between us, we had a garden, and we had vines, and we had all kinds of things. And so I was always cooking either with my mother or my grandmother. Both sides of the family can't come from the same province in southern Italy, so a lot of the things that we're making came from that part of the world, and it was just cooking was a chore, but it was also an entertainment. I didn't do a lot of video games or movies or things like that. We would just cook together, and it was irreplaceable because it was really by those rituals and those things that we just did every day. That was what kind of taught me the importance of food. And each person in my family had a little specific role. Like my maternal grandmother always baked, and for me, from her, I got the heritage and that ceremonial aspect of having a certain bread at the table means and why it's so important. From my mother, she dabbled in catering off and on, and she always made very large scale meals. So I got the scale thing from her. But also she was diagnosed with diabetes when I was a teenager, and I was the family cook. So I had to change our menus to fit her lifestyle. So that's how I got into the diabetes-friendly cooking. And on my father's side, his father was a cook in the Army in World War II. So he was used to rations. So I would go to cook with him as a young child, and he would say, what do you want to make? And I would tell him. He would say, okay, but we don't have this ingredient, we don't have that ingredient. What do you do now? And I was like, I don't know, I'm 3. But it was like Chopped. Every day it was like an episode of Chopped. And so it's great because now I go to Egypt and they don't have a lot of utensils, they don't have a lot of ingredients, and I'm not sweating, whereas another, like a married chef would really pass out if they worked in those conditions. But I'm used to that, so that was okay. And my father was always interested in culinary anthropology. We would always watch National Geographic shows together, and he would say, I wonder what they eat, because they would show people all around the world back in the 70s, but they would never show what they were eating. So I think that planted a seed in my brain, and I always wanted to be the one to answer that question. And now I lecture at National Geographic. So it was definitely, I say it takes a village. It was definitely like a village in my, behind me, kind of spawning me into this. And even further back than that, in southern Italy, our families have bread bakeries and things like that. And so it's definitely in my blood. Yeah. Last question? Okay, last question. Yes?
When you do cook for people that are from other cultures or regions, and you try to cook their food,
Uh-huh.
how much do you have to worry about not making it quite authentic or not as good as their mothers?
That's funny. I think, generally, I think people will be really appreciative. If you're the only home they're going to in a country, they're going to want American food. But if you're one of many, or they're here for a long time, and you want to show them that you tried something, I think it's fine. But people are very worried about if it's like their mother's or not, no matter what culture you do. If I'm presenting an Italian thing, and sometimes I do things with the National Italian American Foundation on Calabria, actually, and I talk about it, and at least 5 people on it. So my mother did it that way. My mother did it. Okay, that's okay. It's everyone's mother is right. There's no right way or wrong way. But that's like the hardest diplomatic thing is when you get into that effort. So you have to preface it with, I know this is not as good as your mother's, but this is just my attempt. and you never know. You might have someone whose mother didn't make it as good as you, and they might like yours better. Thank you all very much.
So I just want to thank Amy for being here. It's been such a pleasure to open up our lecture series with such a fascinating and tasty, I'm not sure about you, but I'm starving now. And I'm really excited that you're here spending time with us. I do hope that you join us as we progress on through the rest of our lecture series. And if you want, Amy is selling some books out front. So please go ahead and help yourself to a great copy and signature. Thank you again.